Imagine a tiny constellation of 3 deep blue lights, shining softly in the darkness. Shiguya Kirigaya gently reached out to touch them with her fingertips. These lights were actually LEDs on the front of a special headset called the nerve gear. They showed what was happening inside the device. The first light on the right meant the power was on. The middle light showed that it was connected to a network, and the third light on the left indicated whether it was linked to the user's brain. If that left light ever turned red, something was seriously wrong. It would mean the user's brain had stopped working. Right now, the person wearing the nerve gear was fast asleep, lying on a big soft bed in a hospital room. The room was painted a calm off-white color, and the bed was designed to be super comfy. But despite the peaceful setting, the wearer was deep in a sleep so strong, they couldn't wake up. Things weren't what they seemed. Kazuto's soul was actually trapped in a far-off world, where he was fighting non-stop to break free. He wasn't alone, thousands of other players were stuck there too. Back in the real world, his sister Suga sat beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Big brother," she said softly to Kazuto, "it's been 2 years already. I'm going to start high school soon. If you don't come back to us, I'll leave you behind." Her fingers gently trailed down his cheek. Kazuto's body had changed a lot since he'd been in a coma. His skin looked like it was sunk in, as if someone had carved out the flesh underneath. His face was already pretty soft and hard to tell if he was a boy or girl. But now it looked even more feminine. In fact, his mom used to tease him by calling him our sleeping beauty. But it wasn't just his face, his whole body was super skinny and gaunt. You could see that he had lost a lot of weight, and it made him look really fragile. Suga was a total athlete, and she had been practicing kendo for as long as she could remember. Now she was probably even stronger than him. Lately, a scary thought kept popping into her head. What if he just disappeared? But whenever she visited him in the hospital, Suga made sure to be strong. For the past year she had been determined not to cry in front of him. She hadn't felt this way since hearing the news from a Ministry of Internal Affairs team member who was handling the SAO incident. The guy with long bangs and black-framed glasses had spoken with respect in his voice. He told her that her brother was one of the top players in the game measured by level. He was part of a small group of skilled players who were brave enough to keep moving forward, even though it was really dangerous. Right now he was probably fighting for his life in the virtual world. Suga couldn't just sit there and cry over Kazuto. She had to be strong for him, so she took his hand in both of hers and gave it a squeeze. "Hang in there, big brother," she said, trying to sound brave. "You can do it." Just then, a voice behind her made her jump. "Oh, you're already here, Suga." She quickly turned around to see who was talking to her.
"Mom," Suga said softly.
The hospital room doors slid open without making a sound, and suddenly they weren't alone anymore. Their mom Midori walked in with a big smile on her face. She carried a beautiful bouquet of cosmos flowers and gently put them into the vase beside the bed. Then she sat down next to Suga, looking relaxed in her casual outfit, a tough leather blouse over a comfy cotton shirt and slim jeans. It looked like she had stopped by on her way home from work. She looked way younger than you'd think. Next year she'd be in her 40s, but you wouldn't guess it. Her makeup was barely there, and her ponytail was tied up in a loose, messy knot. She had tons of energy, which probably came from running a tech magazine. To Suga, she seemed more like an older sister than a mom. "I'm surprised you could visit, Mom," Suga said. "Hey, isn't the print deadline coming up?" Midori just smiled. "I managed to sneak away this time," she said. "I don't usually get to visit, so I wanted to make sure I had time today." They both looked at Kazuto, who was sleeping in bed. "It's his birthday today," one of them said quietly. The two friends stood there in silence for a moment. Then, a gentle breeze came in through the window and moved the curtains. It carried the sweet smell of flowers into the room. Midori spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kazuto is already 16, she said. "I still remember that moment like it just happened. Mintaka and I were sitting in the living room, watching a movie together. Then, out of nowhere, Kazuto popped up and said, 'Tell me about my parents.'" Suga's face broke into a small, nostalgic smile. Her lips curled up slightly, showing a hint of her lip color. It was such a surprise. Kazuto was only 10 years old at the time. "You were gonna have to keep a big secret until you were in high school. That's 7 whole years. But then something weird happened. Your dad figured out that some important information was missing from his records." Suga had never heard this story before, and she wasn't surprised or shocked like you might think. Instead she just smiled. Kind of like her mom was smiling. That's so typical of him, she said, shaking her head. Her parents were caught off guard, and couldn't even come up with a good excuse to deny it. It was like they had planned it that way. Mitaka even admitted that he got them good. They burst out laughing but soon stopped and went back to quietly watching Kazuto sleep. Shuga had grown up with Kazuto living in her house, and everyone thought of him as her brother, but the truth was, he wasn't really her brother, he was her cousin. Her parents, Midori and Minataka Kirigaya, were raising Kazuto, because his mom, Midori's sister, was Sugaha's aunt. Kazuto's life changed forever when he was just a baby. His parents were in a terrible accident, and sadly they didn't survive. Kazuto was hurt really badly, but he made it through. After that his aunt Midori took him in and raised him as her own. But there's something important that not many people know. Kazuto's cousin Sugaha only found out the truth about what happened to Kazuto's parents a couple of years ago. This was after Kazuto got trapped in a virtual world called Sword Art Online, which was a really scary and crazy time for everyone. She was already really upset, and then she turned to her mom, demanding answers. Why had her family kept a huge secret from her for so long? Even 2 years later she still felt angry and frustrated that she was the only one who didn't know the truth. It wasn't until recently that she started to understand why her parents did what they did. They told her sister Suguha the truth just before she started high school because of a sad reason. They wanted to make sure she knew the truth while Kazuto was still alive. The ASCII incident was a disaster that caused over 2,000 deaths in just the first month. Kazuto's parents were terrified that he would be next. They wanted to make sure Suguha wouldn't regret not spending time with him, just in case the worst happened. So Suguha visited Kazuto in the hospital often, trying to figure out how she felt. She was torn between different emotions and wasn't sure what to think. If Kazuto wasn't really her brother, then what was she losing? After thinking about it, Suguha came to a realization: nothing would change. Everything would stay the same, no matter what. Everything was okay and nothing bad happened. Suga just wanted Kazuto to be safe and come home. 2 years went by, and it seemed like one of those wishes was still working out. Suga looked at her mom with a curious expression. "Hey mom," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off her face. "What is it?" her mom asked. "Do you think what happened to Kazuto has something to do with why he got so into online games when he started middle school?" Suga wondered. Her mom Midori understood what Suga was getting at, even though she didn't say it out loud. Midori shook her head right away. "No, that had nothing to do with it," she said firmly. "When he was just 6 years old, he made his own computer using some extra parts I had lying around. He must have picked up on my love for computers without me even realizing it." Suga started giggling and playfully nudged her mom's arm. "Grandma told me you were super into video games when you were a kid," she said with a grin. "That's true. I was a total gaming pro even back in elementary school. Kazuto couldn't keep up with me." They burst out laughing again, and Midori gave the person lying on the bed a warm smile. "But here's the thing, I was never the best player in any of the games I played. I just didn't have what it took to be a top gamer. I wasn't patient enough or driven enough to reach the top." "That's the part he told you, not me. You know why Kazuto is alive? It's because he has your blood in him. The same blood that's made you stick with Kendo for 8 whole years. He'll come back someday. Just wait and see," Midori said with a smile. She gave her daughter a gentle pat on the head and stood up to leave. "I'm heading home now." "Be back before it gets too late," someone said. Midori just smiled and replied, "Don't worry, I won't." She glanced at Kazuto one last time and whispered, "Happy birthday." Then she quickly turned and left the hospital room. Suguha sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She took a deep breath and gazed at the special headgear covering her brother's head. The tiny blue lights on it were blinking fast. They showed how well his brain was connected to the computer network. Imagine a world beyond the computer screen, where Kazuto's mind was exploring the virtual reality of Sei-o. His brain was sending and receiving tons of tiny signals through the Nervegear headset. What was he doing in that virtual world? Was he navigating through a dark dungeon with a map, shopping for cool items, or fighting off a scary monster with his sword? As she looked at Kazuto, she reached out and gently held his pale hand again. But even though she was touching him, Kazuto couldn't feel it. The Nervegear headset blocked the sensations on his skin, so he didn't get any messages in his brain about what was happening to his body in the real world. Shugaha was sure that the strong support she sent to her brother through their special connection would reach him. She could feel it in her heart. His spirit, which was also like a cousin's to her, was radiating an intense energy. This showed that he was determined to stay alive and get back to the real world. As time passed, the warm golden light coming through the white curtains changed, turning into a deep red and then a rich purple. The hospital room grew darker as night fell, but Shuga didn't move a muscle. She sat totally still, focusing on every weak breath her brother took. It wasn't until a month later, on November 7, 2024, that the hospital told her Kazuto had finally woken up. Meanwhile, on a porch somewhere, an unfinished rocking chair creaked back and forth with a soothing clack-clack sound. The gentle light of late autumn shone through the branches of tall cypress trees, casting a warm glow over everything. A gentle breeze blew across the lake, carrying a soothing calmness with it. The girl was sleeping peacefully, her cheek resting on my chest. Her breathing was slow and steady. Time seemed to pass by slowly, filling every moment with a sense of calm happiness. The sound of a clock ticking away filled the air. Tick, tock. I rocked the chair gently back and forth, stroking her soft brown hair at the same time. Even though she was asleep, a tiny smile played on her lips. Outside, some baby squirrels were running around in the front yard, playing and having fun. A yummy stew was cooking on the stove in our tiny house deep in the woods. Life was super peaceful and easy here. I wished it could stay this way forever, but I knew that wasn't possible. With every creak of the rocking chair, time seemed to tick away. I tried to hold on to the moment, but it slipped right through my fingers. I squeezed tight, but my arms were wrapped around nothing. Suddenly my eyes popped open. 1 second we were standing together, and the next she was gone. It was like she vanished into thin air. I jumped up and looked around, but she was nowhere to be seen. The sunset was changing fast, getting darker by the second. It was like a curtain closing in a theater. As night fell, the forest turned black as coal. I stood up feeling the cold wind blow stronger than before, and shouted her name. But there was only silence. She was nowhere to be found in the front yard, which was now empty and quiet. The kitchen was also a no-show for her, but something super weird was happening. The whole house was plunged into darkness. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The walls and furniture of the cozy cabin started to fold up like a pop-up book, flattening out against the ground and disappearing into thin air. Before I knew it, everything around me was gone, except for one thing, the old rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth in the darkness of night. The chair creaked back and forth, empty and spooky. Clack, cluck, cluck. I squeezed my eyes shut, covered my ears, and yelled her name as loud as I could. My scream was so loud and real that even after I woke up with a start, I wasn't sure if I'd really screamed out loud, or just in my dream. I closed my eyes again, hoping to go back to the happy beginning of my dream. But it didn't work. Eventually I had to open my eyes and face the light. When I did, I didn't see the white walls of a hospital room. Instead, I saw walls made of narrow wooden boards. I sat up and took a look around. I was in my own bedroom, the one that belonged to me, Kazuto Kirigaya, in the real world. My bed was just a regular mattress with cotton sheets, no fancy gel material here. And thankfully, there were no tubes stuck in my arms, like you'd see in a hospital. The floor beneath my feet was made of real wood, which is pretty rare these days. It was all so normal and familiar. My room was super sparse, just 3 pieces of furniture. There was a basic computer desk, a wall rack that leaned against the wall, and my simple pipe frame bed. The rack had a few shelves, and on the middle one sat an old piece of headgear. It was a faded navy blue color, and looked pretty worn out. This was a nerve gear, a special device that let you dive into virtual reality. But for me, it wasn't just a cool gadget. It was a reminder of a nightmare. I'd been stuck in a virtual world against my will for 2 whole years. And this thing was the reason why. I finally escaped the virtual world after a brutal fight. I was free to experience life again, to see, touch and feel everything around me. But as I stood up and turned away from the nerve gear, my mind wasn't on freedom. I thought about the girl who had fought alongside me, sword in hand, and shared her deepest feelings with me. I closed my eyes, remembering the adventures we had together. I glanced in the mirror on the other side of my bed. It was a pretty cool mirror, It had a special panel that showed the date and time right above my reflection. The display reads Sunday, January 9th, 2025, 7:15 a.m. It was hard to believe it had been 2 months since I returned to the real world. But even after all that time I still wasn't used to how I looked. I stared at my reflection, and barely recognized myself. My face was the same as Kirito, the brave swordsman I used to be in the virtual world. But my real body, belonging to Kazuto Kirigaya, looked weak and skinny under my t-shirt. I had lost a lot of weight, and hadn't gained it back yet. As I gazed into the mirror, I saw tears streaming down my cheeks, leaving shiny trails behind. I lifted my hand to wipe them away. "Look at me, Asuna," I said, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. I trudged to the big window at the south end of the room, grumbling to myself. I yanked open the curtains with both hands, and the weak winter sun spilled in, painting the room a pale yellow. Outside, Sugiya Kirigai walked across the lawn, her feet crunching on the frosty grass. Yesterday's snow was almost gone, but the mid-January air still had a biting chill. She stopped at the edge of the frozen pond, and leaned her bamboo kendo sword against the trunk of a tall black pine tree. Sugiha took a deep breath and shook off the sleep. She placed her hands on her knees and started to stretch. Her muscles were stiff, but she moved slowly and gently to loosen them up. As she stretched, she felt the blood flowing into her toes, then her Achilles tendons, and finally her calves. It was like a little wake-up call for each part of her body. They tingled as the blood flowed in. Sugiha put her hands together and stretched them down towards the ground. She bent over at the waist, stretching as far as she could. Then she froze, holding still for a moment. Sugiha stood over the frozen pond, her reflection staring back at her from the smooth ice. Her hair was cut straight across, just above her eyebrows and shoulders, and it was so black it almost looked blue. The ice mirrored a girl with thick dark eyebrows and big, confident eyes that gave her a bit of a boyish look. She wore an old-style white dog, with black hakama pants, which added to her bold appearance. As she gazed at her reflection, Sugiha thought about how different she looked from someone else, a thought that had been on her mind a lot lately. She and this person didn't look alike at all, and it was something she couldn't help but notice. Every time Sugiha caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, whether it was in the bathroom or the fancy foyer of their house, one thought kept popping into her head. She didn't dislike her appearance, and she wasn't really concerned about how she looked either. But now that her brother Kazuto was back living at home, she couldn't help comparing herself to him. Sugiha tried to brush off the thought, telling herself it was pointless to think about it. She shook her head and got back to stretching. Once she finished, she walked over to the pine tree and picked up her bamboo sword. She wrapped her hands around the worn handle, feeling it fit snugly in her grip. Then she stood up straight, her hands at her stomach, and held her breath. With a loud "hi," she swung the blade down in a swift motion. The sudden movement startled some sparrows perched above her, and they took to the sky. The Kirigaya house was a traditional Japanese home, in a part of Saitama Prefecture, that used to be a castle town. Even now, it still had many old-fashioned sights that reminded people of the past. Sugiha's family had a long history that went back many generations. Her grandfather, who passed away 4 years ago, was a tough guy who believed in traditional ways. He spent years working as a police officer, and was super skilled at kendo. When he was younger, he wanted his son, Sugiha's dad, to follow in his footsteps and be just as strong and disciplined. Her dad was into kendo when he was younger, but he stopped swinging his shinai in high school. After that, he went to college in the United States. When he graduated, he landed a job at a big company that did business all around the world. He met her mom, Midori, when he got transferred to the office in Japan. Even though he was based in Japan, his job meant he had to travel back and forth across the ocean a lot. Sugiha's grandfather was super passionate, and he usually focused that energy on her and her brother Kazuto. When they were really young, they both started taking kendo lessons at a local dojo. This was the same time they began elementary school. But Kazuto didn't stick with kendo for long. He was more interested in computers, probably because their mom edited a computing magazine. He loved typing away on the keyboard way more than wielding a sword. After just 2 years, he decided to quit kendo altogether. Sugiha didn't exactly plan on becoming a kendo star. She started training just to keep her brother company at the dojo. But it turned out she was a natural even after her grandfather passed away. Shuga kept practicing and loving every minute of it. Now 15 years old, Shuga has already made a name for herself in the kendo world. Last year she rocked her final middle school tournament, placing among the best in the country. She even got a special recommendation to attend one of the top schools in the area for kendo. But despite all her success, Shuga had never really questioned what she wanted to do, until now. Kendo was her passion, and it made her happy to make others proud. But something changed 2 years ago, when a shocking event rocked Japan and took her brother away. Since then, she'd been carrying around a nagging feeling of doubt that she couldn't shake off. It was like regret, wishing she had tried harder to bridge the gap that grew between her and her brother Kazuto. When he quit kendo at age 7, after quitting kendo, Kazuto became super into computers like he just couldn't get enough. When he was a kid he loved to tinker with things. He even built his own machine using spare parts, and learned some basic programming, with the help of his mom. But when he talked about it to Suguha, she just didn't get it. It was like he was speaking a different language. Suguha knew how to use a computer, of course. She had learned the basics in school, and even had her own computer in her room. But she only used it for simple things like sending emails and browsing the internet. Suguha just didn't get her brother's world. The online games he played were totally confusing to her. She couldn't imagine wanting to hide behind a mask and play with others, who were doing the same thing. When they were little kids, Suguha and Kazuto were super close, more like best friends than just siblings. When her brother went off into a world she just didn't get, Suguha felt lost and alone. To fill the emptiness, she turned to kendo. She'd swing her sword, trying to shake off the feeling of missing him. But the more she practiced, the less they talked, and the farther apart they drifted. It got to the point where not talking was just normal. Still, deep down, Suguha couldn't escape that lonely feeling. She really wanted to hang out with her brother more often. She was curious about his life and hoped he'd come watch her compete in something she loved. But before she could work up the courage to talk to him, disaster struck. It started with a super popular online game called Sword Art Online. This wasn't just any game. It was like a nightmare that trapped the minds of 10,000 Japanese kids. They were stuck in a virtual world and couldn't wake up to the real one. Her brother Kazuto had been rushed to a big hospital in Saitama City. Suga's first visit to see her brother in the hospital was a total disaster. He was stuck in bed, surrounded by tangled cords and hooked up to a weird machine that seemed to be sucking the life out of him. A big nasty device was clamped to his head, making him look like a science experiment gone wrong. Seeing him like that was too much for Suguha. She burst into tears and couldn't stop crying. She grabbed onto her brother, wailing loudly, and couldn't let go. The thought of never being able to talk to him again was almost too much to bear. She wondered why she hadn't tried to get closer to her brother. It didn't seem like it should be that hard. Around the same time she started thinking really hard about why she was doing kendo. She thought and thought, but she just couldn't figure out the answer. As time passed, she turned 14 and then 15, but her brother was still gone. As she entered high school, she felt like she was following a path that others had set out for her. But the truth was, she wasn't really sure if it was the right one for her. If he came back, she would finally have the chance to talk to him honestly. She would share all her worries and doubts with him, and ask for his advice on what to do next.